biggest, most outrageous one ever. And then just for the entire song.
Welcome here, everyone. The countdown's done. Mike was supposed to come up here and be all like, "Hi, everyone," but he disappeared. That guy. Anyway, so welcome here. If you're able to stand, we'll invite you to worship with us here tonight. And yeah, if you're still kind of just trying to find a spot, I invite you to find a seat and stuff, and we'll get rolling. There he is.
My bad. I need to watch. My phone's used for the live stream, so I have no way to tell time.
Yeah. See, so this is actually this is a good reminder. Something that I forgot to mention last week. It says on our website that the service starts at 6 o'clock, and usually we start the countdown around 6:05 or so. So something that we're going to start doing fairly regularly, and fairly regularly, I mean just every Sunday, is we're going to be starting the countdown right at 5 to 6 so that we can start the service right at 6 o'clock. So if we've kind of gotten into the habit of maybe showing up a little bit late and stuff, then if you're still in that habit, then you'll be halfway through the first song by the time you actually get here. So little baby announcement right off the top, starting right at 6 o'clock. Cool. Let's 6:02 now because I had to like. All right, let's pray. Let's pray and we'll get started here tonight. Yeah, Father God, thank you for today. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to just be in your presence. Father God, we are here to meet with you, and we're here to meet with each other. Lord, I pray, that you would draw near in this place. Lord, would you remind us of just who you are tonight, Lord, of your goodness, of your grace, your faithfulness, Lord, all those things about you that are true. Lord, help us to, would you break down maybe any lies that we might be believing about you, any lies that we might be believing about ourselves, and replace them with just that true image, Lord. Help us to know you as you know yourself. Help us to know ourselves as you know us to be, Lord. You are good. We love you. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's worship.
Stronger.
Christ the Son, Jesus our Savior. I believe in God our Father, I believe in Christ the Son, I believe in the Holy Spirit, our God is three in one. I believe in the resurrection, that we will rise again, for I believe in the name of Jesus.
So
are our defender. So the same person that is holding us to account is the same person who's defending us, Lord. So thank you for that, Lord. Thank you for just the fact that we are righteous through Jesus, Lord. God, you are good. Pray that you would just continue to meet with us here, Lord. Open our hearts and our minds to receive your word. Help us to just be open to it changing us, Lord. You are good. We love you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Yeah, take a seat.
Thank you, guys. Welcome to Canvas Church, Oak Bay edition. We have a Canvas Church on the West Shore. Excited for all that God's doing on that side of the city, and excited about what God's doing on this side of the city. And so it's good to be back with you. On Thursday morning, I flew to Maryland, which 4 flights. And we live far away from some of those eastern states, and got there and had the privilege of speaking at a conference there on Friday night, and then Saturday morning, and then went straight back to the airport. Took another 4 flights. It got all the way to Vancouver, and they ran out of flights going to Victoria. I didn't get there early enough, so stayed in the hotel last night in Vancouver. Flew back this morning. Landed about 12 o'clock. And hit the ground running. And so, appreciate you guys, several of you praying for me while I was there, and what a privilege to gather with other folks in different parts of the continent, and just to share some of what God's doing here, but also to dig into the scriptures with them, and God's doing some amazing things over in. We're sort of greater Baltimore. We're just outside of the city of Baltimore, and some really cool stuff happening there, and so we're gonna. If I remember, well, let's do it now. I said I'm gonna pray for those guys. They're praying for you, and why don't we pray for them as well? So let's take a moment. Mount Zion Church, just outside of Baltimore. I think actually I think they might be in Bel Air. But Baltimore is sort of greater things. Let's take a moment and let's pray for our friends in Baltimore. And God, we're thankful that you're at work all around the world, and so we're excited about what you're doing here. But we know that God, you're at work in so many ways that we don't even see. And so thank you that we can be tied together with our brothers and sisters in just a small way in Baltimore. God, we pray for Mount Zion Church, pray for Pastor Craig and all the great things that you're doing in that place. God, would they be a shining light for you? We just pray that they be faithful to follow your lead, and that you do miracles in their midst. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you guys for being here. If you're here for the first time, welcome to Canvas. We're a church that values Jesus, relationships, families, and blessing our community. We think that our community should feel the impact of us being here in a good way. And so grateful to serve our community, really to serve Jesus by serving our community and the people that he put us around. And so grateful to be here with you guys. You're dropping in tonight. You may have been here for some of this series. Maybe this is the first one for you. If you want to get caught up, all you got to do is read the first 6 chapters of Genesis, and you'll catch right up to where we are. We're walking through the Old Testament, saying, man, if this all tells one unified story pointing to Jesus. Jesus himself said he's the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets, basically saying everything in the Old Testament led up and pointed to me as his fulfillment. It's like, how do we need to go back and understand the whole story? Because we really live in a culture of fragments, right? We're the Twitter age. And so if it can't fit in 140 characters, then it must not be worth saying, right? And so we're fragments, right? We watch TV shows that are broken up by commercials, unless you just binge it all on Netflix. But we're in especially maybe the younger generation, growing up in a world of fragments, where sometimes it's hard to see big pictures, and we can get so focused on the trees and not see the forest. And so what we're trying to do is let's show how this whole story ties together. And so we've been going through Genesis, and we're going to continue that today. But first, I want to tell you a story, and it's kind of gross. So listener discretion. It's not gross if you have kids. If you have kids, you're like, that ain't nothing. You probably top this story. But we have 3 boys, so we have a lot of gross stories to tell, and I thought I'd tell you one tonight. These are our 2 oldest. That's Everett and Luca. This was Everett's birthday. He wanted to have a Toy Story birthday, and so his grandma sent them this little photo thing where you can stick your head in there. And these 2 guys are kind of inseparable right now. They like to do everything together, and it's great. You know, it's great to see brothers playing together. But if you've had kids or have kids, or remember when your kids were younger, you know that sometimes if things get quiet, you're sort of like it's this weird paradox, right? You're always wanting quiet, but then when quiet comes, you're like, uh-oh. And you're too stressed out about what's happening in the quiet to enjoy the quiet. And so Sarah was watching the boys one day. I was out, and while she had them outside playing one of these beautiful days, right? A break from the rain. So she has the windows open, and so she can hear them, right? And so she's listening to them play, and this is great. The sound of brothers having fun together. And she's doing some stuff in the house, and then it gets kind of quiet, and she doesn't hear them for a little while. And just when she's starting to think like, with 2 brothers, when you don't hear them for a while, chances are fairly high that something's happening that you need to know about. And so she's going to go out there and check on them, and they show up at the back door, and both of them, head to toe, are drenched, soaking wet. The problem was that it wasn't raining. I was like, okay. And so she starts doing the math of like, so where did this water come from? And to her horror, she ends up getting enough information from them to realize where it came from. We've got a toy chest out there in the backyard, and this thing was empty, but it had filled up with rainwater. And our boys decided that they were going to make what they called robot water. I don't know why it's called robot water, but what robot water basically was the boys going throughout the yard finding all of the dog messes and putting it in the water and then adding some things, like garbage or like dirt or robot water basically is like whatever you see lying around can go into that cauldron, and you stir it up nice and good until the water's a nice rich brown, and then they found a couple cups or something and thought it would be fun to dump robot water on themselves, I assume, thinking that they would turn each other into robots. And so they show up at the door and just head to toe covered in robot water. Well, when that happens, it's like into the shower, the clothes go into the pile to burn, and then the boys go into the shower to clean up. It's funny because and that's that sort of thing happens all the time when you have 3 little boys. We're like, oh man, when Finley starts walking, all 3 of them. So at least he wasn't covered in robot water. But when our boys chose to follow their hearts, without consulting the wisdom of their mom, the result was basically they got covered head to toe in filth. They're like, hey, let's take our wisdom. Let's go do what we think is fun. Let's lay aside the rules, the authority figures in our lives. Let's just go live it up. And what it resulted in was covered in filth. This has been really the story that the Bible tells, in one sense, of humanity. It says, look, God set things up for the enjoyment of humanity, to know Him, to love each other, and then at a certain point, humanity said, we want to usurp that place as God. Don't want someone telling me what to do. I want to have my own fun. I want to do my own thing. Rules are for squares. I want to just go. I want to go and do what I want to do. And really, the result, Bible teaches us, is that sin enters the world. that the human heart becomes corrupted, that it's a fall from grace that has spiraled and continued ever since, and what we maybe thought was following our heart and doing the fun thing or whatever really ends up covered in filth, and our lives are as presentable as maybe we wish that they were, and all of a sudden we come before God and we realize, man, before God, I'm not pure like I should be. I'm not what He desires me to be. Sin spread from Adam and Eve to their family, Cain and Abel, that we talked about last week. And what we'll see tonight is that it's a universal thing. That it's not a unique issue for Adam and Eve. It's not a unique issue for their kids, but that sin is universal. And Beckett, I may need you to help me with the slides here because I lost connection. So if you put those verses up, Genesis 6:5 says this. It says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man, of course man means humanity in this context, it says wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's fascinating that God sees that it's a problem with the heart. He's not saying that, oh, there's the occasional person, like their intentions are good, but they did something to fulfill those intentions in a bad way. Like it was, and he says, no, at the heart level, people were corrupted. And so what will God do? What does God do in a case of, man, this widespread issue, the corruption of humanity? And tonight we're going to look at one of the most classic stories in the Bible, Noah's Ark. And as we do, I want to keep a couple things in mind. And here's one. The genre of Genesis, I think, is important to keep in mind when we're going through Genesis. Because if you go to Genesis expecting to read Genesis the way that you would read a history book in your history class today, in a different culture, in a different time, in a different language, then you're going to go through Genesis and not really mine out of Genesis what the author's trying to get you to get from Genesis. Does that make sense? So if we as 21st century, post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution, Westerners speaking English, Canadians, I mean, like all this stuff that separates us from the original audience, if we come at it reading it with that lens, then we're going to miss something. And so what you got to do when you go to Genesis is try as much as we can to sort of put on their culture. Put on the lens that they looked through. And so one of the ways we do that is the genre of Genesis is a theological history. And so what that means is that it covers historical events, but it does so in such a way as to bring out the theological, theology, meaning that the study of God. It's making point, it's teaching things about who God is and who we are and the relationship between the two. And so this theological history, the author's main intention is not to just give you a chronology of facts, right? That's kind of how we do history today, which is why a lot of people get so bored in history class. It's not interesting, right? It's like, in 1802, this happened, and in 1803, this happened, and then this happened, and kids in school are just like, oh, make it stop, The real interesting history teachers are the ones who tell history as an unfolding story, who are saying, hey, let me tell you about this guy, and how this led into this, and how this changed the way people thought about this area, and how the culture followed in this, and that's what makes history interesting, and in that way, the ancient Hebrews were onto something. Because the point of Genesis is to teach you things about God, ultimately, and to teach you things about how God interacts and the history of God's relationship with humanity. Because it's trying to help the original audience understand how did we get to where we are now. So it's not necessarily saying, let me give you every single fact about the land that we came from or whatever. It's saying, let's give you the story that leads up to the significance of where we are now. And likely the first people reading Genesis are probably still wandering in the desert, right? And so they're probably asking questions like, how did we get here? Like, our relationship with God is in this weird situation right now. And so how do we understand how we got here? And so when you come to Genesis, you have to realize that the way they wrote historical accounts in ancient culture was always to bring out the theological point foremost. Now, that doesn't mean that these things didn't happen. It just means that part of the style that they used was often hyperbole. And so with us, in the way we do history, we don't really use hyperbole. We don't really want to stretch and play with the facts too much. We want to just lay out as accurately as we can. The way that they did history was like, okay, here's the main idea of what happened, but we're going to elevate certain things, we're going to highlight certain things, and we're going to even exaggerate certain things because we want to make sure you don't miss the main point. Because the main point is, whatever the main point happens to be about who God is and his relationship with his people. So as we tread through this story, we just need to realize that their view of history when they were writing this was to do a lot of the interpreting for us, where our view of history is to just give the facts and then let the reader or listener interpret those things, right? So it's just, this is what happened. Now you can draw whatever conclusions that you draw from that. They did that for the reader. So they're saying, here's sort of what happened, but here's the significance of what happened. And so what are the theological themes presented in the Noah story? There's probably more, maybe there's less, but as I was going through this story, rather than going through every single verse, because it's a few chapters, I want to pull out some of the big themes. What is the Noah story trying to get across to us? And here's theme number one: the corruption of humanity. The corruption of humanity. It's a story of what happened. You can put that up there, Beckett. What happened to humans, right? How did they go from a good place with God, this intimate place with God, to what any person in that day and any person in our day can clearly see? We look around and we're just like, man, like something's broken, like something's not right. How did we get here? Like how did we get to this place? And so let me read for you Genesis chapter 6. Becky, you can put that on the screen. It says, now look for the common word in these verses. There's a common word here. It says, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight. I helped you out a little bit to find it. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Can you see the point that Genesis is trying to drive home at this section? It's saying, look, corruption has happened. And corruption is saying, what does that mean? It's not just saying, so things were bad. It's saying things were corrupt. Let me give you an example. Becky, you can put that picture up there. How many of you guys like chocolate milk? Yeah, everybody's hand should be up, unless you have some sort of allergy. Chocolate milk is awesome. And so my dad, he actually worked at it was a psychiatric hospital, and he worked the night shift. And so that was an interesting experience. He was going to seminary to become a pastor during the day, so he would go to school all during the day, and then he would work the night shift at night, and then I think he'd take a nap in between. And like that's sort of how he got through life for a while. And so when you're working the night shift, things can get pretty slow, and so you're always trying to find something to like liven it up. And so he was working this night shift with his buddy, and they were always, one of the things they would do is they would always, like as they're doing their rounds, they would go into the kitchens and they would see like, man, is there anything good in here? Like every now and then someone would bring something good, and you sort of open the door and be like, I wonder how like if this person is going to notice if like one of their pieces of pizza is gone, or you sort of always look around for somebody. Maybe someone just wanted to be nice and they brought cupcakes or something. Oh man, yes, like the day shift left this stuff for us, and so they're doing that, right? He and his buddy are doing that. Well, my dad goes into this room, and typically you would try to share with each other, but it was also like first come, first serve, every man for himself kind of deal. So Dad goes into this small kitchen, opens the door of the fridge, and finds a big thing of chocolate milk. And like when you're tired and you're working the night shift, like there's nothing better than just a cold chocolate milk. And so he gets this thing, and his buddy walks in like right after him. And it's like, oh, is there chocolate milk? And my dad, has this moment where he's like, I could share with my coworker, or I could have the whole thing of chocolate milk to myself. And he's like, in this moment of weakness, my fallen nature, my corrupted nature just takes over. And he's like, not only am I going to drink this chocolate milk, but I'm going to make a big show of it. And like, I'm going to rub it into my coworker. And there was just this friendly rivalry going on. So he opens this chocolate milk and he takes this huge gulp. Now, what he didn't realize was that about a month and a half earlier, they were doing some renovations on that wing of the hospital. And while they were doing those renovations, they turned off the power, including the power to that fridge. Now, unfortunately for my dad, the chocolate milk had been placed in the fridge prior to the power going off. And so he gets a full-on throat full of month and a half chocolate milk that is sat in a warm fridge. And he just says, like, he says, you think you know, when we were talking about this story earlier this week, he's like, you think you know how horrible that experience was? He's like, you have no idea. He's like, whatever the worst thing is you can come up with in your mind, like, triple it. And then you're getting close. It's just like when the milk slides out as a solid. You're just like, wait a second, milk's not supposed to be solid. Spews it everywhere. Of course, his friend is just dying laughing, like, oh, to the winner go the spoils. Like, you enjoy your chocolate milk. That's what it means talking about corruption. Corruption isn't just this thing is just bad. Didn't start off bad, still bad, it's always going to be bad. Corruption is this idea of taking something that was good and twisting it and ruining it and saying this thing was once good and it once served its purpose and served its purpose well. Like chocolate milk, it's packaged up, it's flavored, it's in the fridge for a reason. Like, it's not meant to be a doorstop, right? It's not meant to be a paperweight. Do we even use paperweights anymore? Do we use paper anymore? It was like, I don't know. My generation doesn't, I don't think. But like chocolate milk's not meant for that. It's meant to be a refreshing beverage, right? When it becomes corrupted, when it becomes curdled, when it becomes solid, all of a sudden you're like, this is corrupted. It doesn't serve the purpose that it was meant to serve. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. And when God looks at humanity, it says humanity started one way, and yet something has corrupted them. They're no longer doing what they were created to do. They're not worshiping. They don't have a relationship with their Creator. It says there was violence on the earth. They don't have a relationship with each other. It says humanity has been corrupted. That's part of what the Noah story is trying to get across. It's saying, look, like things started one way, but then took a nasty turn, and now the situation is dire. Theme number 2, Becky, you can put this up there. It says, really, the judgment of God. In the Noah story, right, he comes to Noah, he chooses Noah and his family, and says, look, I've looked on the earth, and all I see is corruption. And so I'm going to do something about it, and I'm going to preserve you and your family. And then God gives them all these instructions. You're to build this boat. This is how you're going to survive what's coming. And so Noah and his family, they, classic story, build this boat. And then when the rains come, you guys will be able to wait out this disaster in the safety of this boat. Genesis 6, continuing, says this. Maybe you can put these verses up there. It says, and the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. And this is interesting to me. So God is feeling something towards this, right? And sometimes when you look at the Noah story, it can seem like God is a distant God that's just destroying the world, and it can seem very removed from any sort of heart, any sort of emotion. It says, grieved him to his heart. That's powerful language talking about God, right? In the ancient world, you didn't really, like, when you talked about the emotions of the gods, it was usually petty stuff. There was jealousy that was happening, there was lust that was happening, all that sort of stuff. But you didn't often talk about the gods in such a way that they really cared, that they empathized, they cared about humanity. And here it's saying when God looks at the corruption, he's grieved to his heart. Now, why is he grieved? Well, there's a lot of reasons why, but if you think, if humanity is created in God's image, and every sin that they commit is ultimately directed towards him, right? Every sin is a usurping of his authority, of saying, I desire to live my own way apart from you. I just think, man, like with my own kids, and with any parent, when your kids rebel against you, it almost doesn't matter what the actual thing is that they're doing, right? The specifics of it, because ultimately it grieves your heart because it makes its way back to you. And it's like, man, they're doing this, they're doing this. It hurts this person and it hurts this person, but it grieves my heart as a parent because all of this is a reflection of a rebellion against our relationship and what I've taught them and what we desire to have together. And so you can imagine if corruption is all over the earth, and that's all pointed back at the Creator, it's no wonder that it grieves the heart of God. It says, "So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of heaven, for I am sorry that I have made them." There's a fascinating fact about history that there's actually many flood stories. If you go back into ancient history, there's a lot of different cultures that have flood stories, and there's a lot of similarities. There's also a lot of differences. You can put that picture up there, Beckett. I think this is fascinating. George Smith. He was kind of a loner. He used to go to the library. He used to go to the British Museum and just sort of study things. And eventually people took notice of him, and they were like, "This guy seems to sort of know what he's doing." He was studying these ancient languages, and so they brought him in and said, "Look, we've got all these ancient tablets that we don't know how to read. Like, could you help us sift through and translate this stuff?" And so he does, and he starts going through all of this stuff. And he starts going through what's called the Gilgamesh epic, which is this ancient tale, and it includes a flood narrative. It includes a version of a flood story that has a lot of parallels with the Noah story. And it's funny, this sort of reserved nerd scholar, it is said when he had this breakthrough and he translates this and he sees the parallels between this and the Noah story. It says, if you can picture this, it says he was so excited that he started running through the museum and the library, tearing his clothes off. It's like, the guy's excited, man. One account says he jumped up on the table. It's just like, this guy, he's so excited about his discovery that, I mean, he's being undignified, right? And what he discovered, actually, was the Gilgamesh epic is the oldest long-form poem that has been discovered. And so he makes this incredible historical discovery, but at the same time, he also sees all these parallels and saying, look, like all these different cultures throughout the ancient world had these versions of a great flood. And there's a lot of similarities. There's more differences than similarities. And so it's not as if these things are all exactly the same. But you know what one of the biggest differences is actually the motivation behind God or the gods for the flood. And so in one version, not the Gilgamesh epic, although they think maybe in this one too, this one's not as clear why the gods flood the earth, but in another version, the gods' motivation is simply that humanity's too noisy. The gods are trying to live up in the heavens, and this is like, and basically year after year, the people are living, like we're just living down here, and the noise is going up to the gods, and they basically are like, I can't take the noise anymore. Let's wipe them out. And it was like, man, like those gods wouldn't have lasted long in our house with 3 little boys. But the Bible teaches us the motivation for God is actually the wickedness of humanity. It's not that these guys are too loud or these guys are. It says when God looked out over humanity, He saw that there's a fallen nature that is expressing itself in violence and wickedness. And it actually goes straight to the heart. And so one quick thing that often, obviously, I think a really good question that comes up when you're looking at this stuff is God's destruction of humanity evil? This is an important question. This is a big question that we would need a lot more time to really get into. But you look at, okay, so God declares that he's going to judge humanity, and he's going to judge them pretty severely. Here's four quick thoughts on that, and then if you have more questions about that, because that's a big topic, I'd be happy to talk with you. Send me an email. Email's better for me because it gives me time to sort of lay some stuff out if you want a little bit more comprehensive answer. I don't necessarily have all the greatest answers for this, but I can give you some thoughts to it. But here's a few thoughts. Number one, God is the authority on good and evil. And so oftentimes if we're going to put ourselves in the judgment seat to judge the actions of God, we're actually doing a bit of a reversal of how it should be. And so, for us to say, well, God is evil to have done this, we have to ask ourselves, so where does good and evil come from? Like, what's the standard of good and evil? And do we have the standard of what that is in order to make a clear judgment towards God? And that's the second point, is that we may not be in the best unbiased position to make judgments on God's actions. Right? There's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot of things we don't understand. We don't see the full picture. And so I think there's a certain humility that we need to adopt, when really that probably we should adopt just all the time anyways. But when we look at the actions of God, to say, okay, I need to understand that I don't have the fullest picture of this when I look at it as well. Another thing is sometimes, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm often okay with the judgment falling on other people, but not so much when the judgment falls on me. And what I mean by that is, it's sort of connected to number two about maybe not being unbiased, is when we see evil things happening and other people are the ones doing those evil things, we're a little bit more quick to say, well, yeah, that should happen to them. They need to be punished for that. They committed the crime, they need to do the time, like that sort of thing, right? But then when we're the guilty ones, all of a sudden it's like, oh man, maybe there should be some leniency here. Like, does it have to be this way? And because we often include ourselves within this big thing, and we should, right? If humanity's corrupted and we're part of that, then we sort of feel for humanity at this point, because we identify with them. And sometimes it's like, well, maybe God was a little bit harsh to do this. And sometimes I think it just shows a little bit of, it's hard to remove ourselves from our own bias in that. Because we're talking about stuff that maybe we deserve as well, coming from God. And then the last one is this, and this is an important theological point that is also played out in this, is that it actually points to God's justice. And what I mean by that is when we see evil not being addressed, right? If we see evil running rampant and there are people who could do something about it and they don't do something about it, we actually see that there's an injustice. So let me just kind of make up an example here. And then let's use it's talking about violence, let's use a pretty hard example. So somebody goes into your home. You're not there, your family is there, and this guy's a murderer, and he comes in and he takes out your whole family. And then all of a sudden you're at the courtroom and they're about to pass judgment on this guy. They catch the guy, they bring him there, you're in the courtroom, and the judge simply says, well, I don't want to be too harsh about this, like, let's just forget about it. Let's forget that let's just forget that this ever happened. And, and you're suddenly like, what do you mean? Like, there's going to be no penalty? There's nothing? The judge is like, no, like, there doesn't need to be anything. Just let him go live his life. Why do we all waste our time here? Suddenly you're outraged, being like, that's not just. Like, that judge is not just, because he just did nothing. Like, he let somebody commit an atrocious evil and did nothing about it. Now, I can see where, there's more to that argument, right? You might say, well, does the punishment fit the crime? And even if, the judge does something, may not have to be death, but maybe you should do something at another level. And those are all good discussions to have. But at the heart of it, I think we even understand that evil demands a response, right? To let evil off the hook is actually to do something that is unjust. And so in one sense, I believe that this story is actually speaking to the justice of God, that he will not watch evil and let it continue to play out unaddressed. Now, we may take issues in the severity of what he does towards the evil, and those are great discussions. Those are things that people have debated and talked about. But I think we would find some common ground by saying to not address evil is actually to not bring justice to the situation. And so how's God going to deliver this judgment? Well, this is how the ancient audience would have understood this. God started here, and I'm gonna do this. All right, live stream. See if this works. Whiteboard over here. Never use the whiteboard, so let's try this. So God starts. Oh man, I have to be careful about that. So God starts with what they really considered non-order. So this isn't just like craziness. It's just non-order. And so it's like, okay, there's a board, but there's nothing really there. There's nothing really on there. Sort of there's potential there, but it hasn't been brought into order. And then what we see is he brings things through creation into order. So we'll just do, that's the earth. I would say that's the earth. And so all of a sudden you take non-order and you see God forming it, and you see God labeling it and giving purpose to it, and all of a sudden it's like I bring non-order into order. Then we get to Genesis 3. We were in Genesis 3 a couple weeks ago, and you see this fall take place, this fracturing take place. So we'll just say, we'll just kind of put some cracks in the earth. We'll sort of put some spikes out there. And now all of a sudden you have something, you went from non-order, brought things into order, now you're in a state of disorder. Now something that had purpose, that had a point, that was brought together to do a certain purpose, now all of a sudden you've cracked that and you've broken that and you're in a state of disorder. And so what you see in the flood account is God actually returning things back, not just back to a state of order first, but all the way back to a state of non-order. And it's these interesting parallels. If you go to the very beginning of Genesis, it starts by saying the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. And then he speaks and starts putting things into place and starts bringing order to what they saw as chaos. In the ancient mind, water almost always represented chaos. And so we live by the water, right? And we can go and see the waves, and we think it's beautiful. In ancient cultures, it was not necessarily seen as beautiful. That's where the sea monsters were, which were seen as these creatures of disorder, right? Disorder, these chaos creatures. And so water was this sense of like, man, the water is just unknown. It hasn't been brought into any sort of state of order. And you see that at the very beginning of Genesis. And in the flood story, you see God returning things back to that. And so he's not just saying, I'm going to return things back to the way it was in the garden. The garden was ordered. He said, I'm going to return things all the way back. And so basically, if you want a visual of what the flood story is doing, it's doing this. Boom. All the way back to the beginning. It's saying, let's take things back to a state of just non-order. And then what happens is as the floodwaters recede, and as God again makes a covenant with Noah, and he actually uses very similar language with Noah as he does with Adam and Eve. He says, go, be fruitful, and multiply. And he makes this covenant with the people. He's bringing things back to this. You got the rainbow. So what God is doing is he's bringing things back to a state of order. And then you see the rainbow on the earth, and God basically says this rainbow. Oh yeah, it's like these guys can watch the whiteboard for the rest of the time. And so what God's doing is he's bringing things back to this place of non-order first, and then order. It's really this sense of do-over. It's saying, okay, let's wipe things clean and let's start again. And so that's in the ancient mind, that's how they would have understood this. They would have said, God is bringing things back to the way they were at the beginning, and then he's gonna move it forward from there. And so I want to show you a quick video before we wrap things up here. And I just find this interesting. Now, let me give a caveat to this video. this is not necessarily like proof that this is where the flood happened, right? And so, because the other way that they would have seen this is that there's different ways to interpret some of these verses, right? Some people will say it was this cataclysmic worldwide thing. Other people would interpret it and say, well, no, there's a possibility this could have been a local thing where it destroys the known world. Everything that they knew about the world was destroyed. The line of people that it's been following from the beginning, it maybe was them. But what's fascinating to me is that all these cultures have these flood stories. And so this is just sort of interesting. Check this video out as an example of perhaps the kind of flood that would have stuck in this memory that we actually have some pretty good scientific evidence for. So check this video out, and then we'll wrap things up.
Our journey to investigate the story of Noah and his ark led us to the banks of the Black Sea in Turkey, where we heard that tantalizing clues were being uncovered by Dr. Robert Ballard, one of the world's leading underwater archaeologists.
All right, let's get closer down.
We were astonished to learn that he believes the biblical flood could have actually happened, and he says he can find proof.
Something here, what's this?
If you were to discover definitively something that could pin science on the Noah story, how fantastic would that be?
Well, it would be pretty cool, and I'm confident we can. We just have to look.
Now, using advanced robotic technology, he's traveling even further back in time.
I'm putting a lot of money in the water, and obviously can't wait to see what it's going to see. We talk about the floods of our living history. Boy, they don't compare at all to the floods of ancient times. The question is, was there a mother of all floods?
Ballard thinks there was, and he's testing a controversial theory that the biblical flood happened here.
Why the Black Sea? Well, because the Black Sea appears to have had a giant flood. Not just a slow-moving, advancing rise of sea level, but a really big flood, and people were living there.
The theory goes this was once an isolated freshwater lake, but then, when the Mediterranean swelled,
At some magic moment, it broke through and flooded this place violently.
What did Noah or the people who lived there during what you believe to be this huge flood, what did they see?
It probably was a bad day, and a lot of real estate, 150,000 square kilometers of land, went under.
and 400 feet below the surface, Ballard believes he's found proof of that catastrophic event.
I love it. I love it.
They unearthed an ancient shoreline.
Well, we actually dated it, about 5,000 BC.
And that is about the time that the Bible says
Exactly.
Noah and the great flood happened. I mean, wow.
Wow. So it nailed it.
So I thought that was interesting. I'm not saying, yeah, it's exactly there, but it's fascinating to see, like, what a kind of cataclysmic event would put this into the minds of so many different cultures. And so let me give you the last. We're gonna, for the sake of time, let me give you the last two real quick. Last two themes. Number 3, Noah's faithfulness to God. Genesis 6, continuing, says, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God." Now, we know that Noah wasn't perfect. We know that Noah wasn't sinless. But in a generation that was as corrupt as his, it says, like, Noah walked with God. And I love that because I think the corruption at its heart is a corruption of that. It's saying they're not walking with God anymore. They once did, and now they're not. And then theme 4 is this, the grace of God. You can put that 4th theme up there. It's not that Noah was perfect. It's that God had grace on some people. The question is not necessarily why did God destroy like a bunch of people. It's why didn't God destroy everybody? He shows grace to this family. God has given humanity another chance, even though their hearts are still bent towards evil. Look at Genesis chapter 8. To round off this story. This is after everything's over. It says, and when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, so after the flood waters recede, Noah does an offering up to God. It says, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth, right? It sort of asks the age-old question, are people naturally good or naturally bad? The Bible says, God right here says, from their youth people are bent towards evil. But he says, even though I know they're going to be evil again, I promise not to ever do on this scale what I've done now. It says, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. And it says, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so you see an echo of what he said to Adam and Eve, saying, all right, you guys go and do this. And we may ask ourselves, why does God do that? Like, why does God give humanity another chance? He knows they're evil. Why give them another chance? And I guess best I could say to that is that when Sarah and I were deciding if we were going to have kids, we knew that just like we were and just like every other human, that they were going to be bent towards evil. That bad was going to be natural to them, that we would have to train good into them, teach good into them. We also knew that there would be the great possibility of our kids really causing us pain. And yet, we decide to have kids anyways. As we say, even though that possibility is there, the love we have for them and the possibility of the love we can get in return, that to us is a greater good than never taking that chance. And so there may be a lot of reasons. We don't know all the heart of God of why he does this, but part of it is because God's a God of grace. And he knows that, yeah, people are still going to be evil. And yet, as we continue in this story, we see that this isn't the end of the story for God. God begins to address that problem and will address that problem once and for all in the person of Jesus. And so I'm going to invite the band to come back up, and they're going to lead us in a song here at the end, a song of worship. And as they do, I hope tonight that whatever view you have of God, wherever you are in that journey, I hope that you would see that God is a God of justice. And sometimes throughout history, being a God of justice meant addressing evil in a very big way. But on the other side of that coin, right, if God is a God of love, and one side of that coin is a God of justice that says real love won't let evil go unaddressed. The other side of that coin is grace, by saying, but that's not the only part of the story. There's grace in there as well. And God's saying, I'm gonna continue to move the plan forward with these guys. And what we're going to find is that Noah and his family were not perfect and made some big mistakes too. But God's saying, but I'm going to move this story forward. And ultimately, this is all pointing towards Jesus. And so would you stand? And these guys are going to lead us. And my encouragement to us is Genesis 6:9. It says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And so let me ask you tonight, does that describe your life? When you look at your life, you say, I know I'm not perfect. Noah wasn't perfect. But in his generation, he stood out as unique because he walked with God. Is that us today? In a culture that maybe has rejected God or is not interested in God or whatever else, do we represent people who say, look, I'm not perfect. Noah wasn't perfect. But in my generation, I try to walk with God. God's a God of grace who has shown me grace when he could have shown me judgment. And in a response to that, I walk with that God and I try to represent him well to our community. And so, is that you? And so maybe as we sing and as we worship, you would just worship and give thanks to God for showing you grace, for not bringing judgment on your life. Say, God, what do I do in response to the grace that you've shown me? And so you sing, and then we'll bring things to a close.
Worthy of every song. praise we could ever bring. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe, we'll live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only
moment. I don't know about you, but when I read the Noah story, all I can see is like, man, I don't know, the evil of my own heart. And compared to God's holiness, like that's what I deserve, right? And yet I see God's grace. And ultimately, remember, if all this sin is directed really at God, then what do we have with Jesus? We have God, in the person of Jesus, taking on the punishment and the sin for each one of us. If you can imagine the flood happening, but being poured onto one person. God, the one who has been offended, saying, I'm going to take the judgment. I'm going to be just and address evil, but I'm going to take it on myself. And so that you can be forgiven. Not to get way ahead in the story, but if you want to see how this ties to Jesus, that's how it ties to Jesus. It's God saying, how do I ultimately fix this problem? Well, I need to take this on myself so that I can be just, but also so I can offer forgiveness for people, that they might be set free from judgment, that they might be set free from their sin. And so when I read this story, it brings me to a place of gratitude. And so I hope that you leave here as well with gratitude towards a God who has shown you grace. When me and you should have been in that water, God has shown us grace. And so just a few things by way of announcement. If you're here for the first time with us, we're so glad that you joined us tonight. There's some envelopes on the chairs, and if you wouldn't mind filling out some of your info and putting that in that back box on the info table, we'd love to have a record of your visit. We'd love to connect with you at a later time. Also, if you feel God leading you to give an offering tonight, you can do that as well on those back tables. There's still room to come on our ski trip on Saturday, and so if you're looking to tear up the mountain, man, there's a carload of folks already headed out that way. If you want to go, let us know. We might need to add another vehicle to the carpool, or you might need to hold on to the top of our Honda Pilot or something. But we'll carpool up to Mount Washington together. This is this coming Saturday. Also want to let you know about a conference coming up, and I have information printed out about it that I left in my backpack. So I'll put that on the back table in just a minute. But some friends of ours over at Lighthouse Church are actually putting on a conference coming up this weekend. And so Friday night and then Saturday morning for the day, for some of the day, they're putting on a great conference about how do we live out the gospel in everyday life. And Becca, there may be a slide for this. It's like how you don't have to be a trained professional. You don't have to be some superstar. How do you live out the gospel, this grace of God? How do you live that out in every day? Essentially, what they're saying is you can plant churches and you can also plant people. You can plant Christians, right? And as we go out into the world, God can use us at our workplace, wherever we go, to be a light for Him wherever we go. And so if that's something you're like, man, I think I resonate with that. The conference is only like $10, and there's some info on that page on how to register for that. But that'll be Friday night and Saturday. And so I encourage you, if you're not doing the skiing thing, and if you got that time, I think it'd be well worth your time. So a couple friends of ours and other churches are putting this thing together. We'd love to support what they're doing. So let me ask you guys to stand one more time, get our exercise tonight, and let's pray together. Let's pray that, oh, yes. Mustard seed's full. So, yeah, but if you really, really, really want to go serve at the mustard seed, we can maybe fit you in. Yeah, and we mentioned last week about this new ministry that we're launching for young families and for kids, and there were some things sort of out of our control that changed the schedule of that, and so we're going to launch that in April instead of March. So just so you know, we'll put some more info out about that. But really excited about launching this monthly ministry for families and for kids, and it's going to be great. And so we want to make sure that we do it well and that we do it right. And so some things got out of our control, changed up that schedule. And so rather than just trying to force it and do it anyways, we're like, hey, this is going to be our way to connect to the community. We want to do this well, and we don't want to rush this thing. And so we postponed the launch of that to April, but you're going to want to be there in April. It's going to be incredible. So let me pray for us, and let's pray that we would be a good example of this grace that God shows to us, that we would show that to the world. God, we thank you. We thank you that when we deserved judgment, you've shown us grace. And God, we may think that we're pretty good in our own eyes, but when we put ourselves up against your holiness, we realize we fall very short. And yet, God, you have shown us grace. And so for that tonight, we thank you. And as we go from this place, God, would we be a clear representation of your grace to a world around us? Would we treat people in such a way, would we live in such a way that we would represent you well, that people would see us, and through us, although imperfectly, they would see some sort of reflection of who you are and the difference that you've made in our lives, that they might be drawn to you, to have that same relationship with you. God, we know that's what you desire for this city. Would you use us towards those ends, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you guys. We'll see you again soon.